The crash echoed through the living room like a gunshot, and Denise Thompson's heart stopped beating for what felt like an eternity. She stood frozen, staring at the broken pieces of Robert's prized ficus pot scattered across the hardwood floor, dirt spilling everywhere like dark secrets finally seeing daylight. But it wasn't the soil that made her blood run cold, it was what lay hidden beneath it, gleaming in the afternoon sun streaming through their Atlanta home's bay window. A small brass key, a memory card wrapped in plastic, and a letter in her father's unmistakable handwriting, yellowed with age but preserved perfectly in a sealed envelope marked with one word, proof. Denise's hands trembled as she knelt beside the mess, her mind racing back 20 years to the day she'd married Robert Thompson, the charming real estate developer who'd swept her off her feet during her junior year at Spelman College. She remembered how he'd insisted on bringing that particular ficus plant to their new home, claiming it was a housewarming gift from his grandmother. For 2 decades, she dusted around it religiously, never questioning why he was so protective of that one plant, why he always positioned it in the exact same corner, why he grew tense whenever Clara played too close to it. Now she knew why. Her father's letter lay open in her shaking hands, each word hitting her like a physical blow. Samuel Jefferson had been a community organizer, a man who dedicated his life to fighting for affordable housing in their neighborhood. The letter, dated just days before his sudden heart attack 15 years ago, revealed a truth so devastating that Denise felt the room spinning around her. "My dearest daughter," it began, "if you are reading this, then something has happened to me, and my worst fears about your husband have proven true. Robert Thompson is not the man you think he is. The development projects he's been working on, the ones that displaced Mrs. Jenkins and 12 other families from Peach Street, they were built on lies, forged documents, and stolen land deeds. I have evidence. I have proof. And I believe he knows I'm getting close to exposing him." The memory card contained photographs, audio recordings, and documents that painted a picture of systematic fraud spanning decades. Robert hadn't just stolen from the community, he targeted elderly black homeowners specifically, using predatory tactics to force them from properties their families had owned for generations. Then he'd flipped those properties for millions, building luxury condos where family homes once stood. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. "I confronted Robert 3 days ago," her father's letter continued. "I told him I knew what he was doing, that I would expose him unless he made things right. He laughed, Denise. He looked me in the eye and laughed. Then he said something that chilled me to the bone. 'Old man, you have no idea how deep this goes. And you have no idea what I'm capable of. I'm hiding this evidence where I pray you'll find it someday if something happens to me.' The key opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank. Box 447. Everything you need is there." Denise's world crumbled as she realized the implications. Her father's heart attack had been sudden, unexpected, devastating to their family. He'd been healthy, active, passionate about his work. The doctors had said stress, genetics, bad luck. But now, staring at his final words, she understood the truth that had been hidden for 15 years. Robert had killed her father. The sound of the front door opening made her jump. Robert's voice called out from the foyer, "Honey, I'm home early. Clara's recital got moved to tonight, remember?" Panic flooded through Denise as she quickly gathered the evidence, stuffing it into her purse while frantically trying to clean up the dirt with her bare hands. Her mind raced. How long had Robert been planning this? Had he married her to keep an eye on what her father might have discovered? Had their entire marriage been built on lies and murder? Denise? What was that crash? Robert's footsteps approached the living room. She stood up, dirt still clinging to her hands, trying to compose herself. "I'm sorry, baby. I was dusting and accidentally knocked over your ficus. I'll replace it, I promise." Robert appeared in the doorway, his face cycling through emotions. Surprise, anger, then something else. Something cold and calculating that she'd never noticed before. His eyes swept the area where the plant had been, and she saw him tense when he realized the pot had been completely destroyed. It's fine," he said slowly, but his voice carried an edge she'd never heard. "Just a plant, right? These things happen." But Denise could see him scanning the floor looking for something. Looking for what she'd already found. That night, as Robert sat at Clara's piano recital applauding their daughter's performance, Denise felt like she was watching a stranger. Every smile seemed fake, every gesture calculated. When he reached over to hold her hand during Clara's solo, she had to fight not to pull away. This man, the father of her child, her partner of 20 years, had murdered her father and built their comfortable life on the graves of displaced families. The worst part wasn't just what he'd done. It was how good he'd been at hiding it. How he played the role of loving husband and father while systematically destroying lives. How he'd probably planned every moment of their relationship, every conversation, every family decision to protect his secrets. As Clara took her bow and the audience applauded, Denise made a decision that would change everything. Her father had died trying to expose the truth. She wouldn't let his sacrifice be in vain. But she also knew she was in danger. If Robert had killed once to protect his secrets, he wouldn't hesitate to kill again. She had to be smart, careful, strategic. She had to protect Clara while building a case strong enough to bring him down. The memory card felt heavy in her purse as they drove home that night, Clara chattering excitedly about her performance in the back seat. Robert kept glancing at her in the passenger seat, and Denise wondered if he could sense that something had changed. That the wife who'd trusted him blindly for 20 years was gone, replaced by someone who now saw him for exactly what he was. As they pulled into their driveway, Denise realized this was just the beginning. She had evidence of fraud, displacement, and murder. But she also had an 8-year-old daughter to protect and a husband who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened his carefully constructed life. The next morning would bring new challenges, new revelations, and the beginning of a journey that would test everything she thought she knew about justice, family, and survival. But tonight, as she tucked Clara into bed and kissed her forehead, Denise Thompson made a silent promise to her father's memory and to every family Robert had destroyed. She would expose the truth. She would get justice. And she would make sure that her daughter grew up in a world where men like Robert Thompson couldn't hide behind charm and privilege while destroying communities. The broken ficus pot had revealed more than evidence. It had revealed her purpose. Denise barely slept that night, staring at the ceiling while Robert snored peacefully beside her. Every sound made her jump. Was that footsteps? Was he awake? Did he suspect? The memory card and key felt like they were burning through her purse downstairs, evidence so powerful it could destroy not just Robert, but potentially her entire life. When morning came, she moved through their usual routine like an actress playing a role. She made Robert's coffee exactly how he liked it, packed Clara's lunch with extra care, and kissed them both goodbye with the same warmth she'd shown for 20 years. But inside, she felt hollow, like someone had scooped out her heart and replaced it with ice. After Robert left for work and Clara for school, Denise sat at her kitchen table and called in sick to her accounting firm. She needed time to think, to plan, to figure out her next move without arousing suspicion. The First National Bank was only 15 minutes away, but those 15 minutes felt like stepping into a different universe. The safety deposit box key felt tiny in her palm as she handed it to the bank employee, a young woman named Tiffany who chatted pleasantly about the weather while leading her to the vault. Box 447 was small, unremarkable, just like the thousands of secrets hidden in similar boxes throughout the bank. But when Denise opened it, she understood why her father had risked everything to preserve its contents. Photographs of forged signatures. Audio recordings of Robert bribing city officials. Copies of original property deeds that had been lost in mysterious fires. Financial records showing payoffs to inspectors, lawyers, and politicians. And most damning of all, a recording of Robert himself, speaking to someone her father had identified as a city councilman. The old folks don't understand how the game works. Robert's voice came through clearly on the small digital recorder. They think their little deeds and their family history mean something. But money talks louder than sentiment. We make them an offer they think they can refuse, then we make their lives so difficult they have no choice but to take whatever we give them. What about the ones who still won't sell? The councilman asked. Robert's laugh made Denise's skin crawl. There are ways to handle stubborn people. Sometimes they have accidents. Sometimes they get sick. Sometimes they just disappear from the neighborhood. Amazing how quickly people change their minds when they realize nobody's coming to help them. The recording continued for another 30 minutes, detailing a systematic campaign of harassment, fraud, and intimidation that had displaced over 60 families in the past decade. Families who'd lost homes that had been in their bloodlines since Reconstruction. Children who'd been forced to change schools, elderly people who'd lost their community connections, small businesses that had folded when their customer base was scattered. But it was the final recording that broke her heart completely. Her father's voice, strained and frightened. Robert, I'm giving you one last chance to do the right thing. Make restitution to these families. Stop the Peach Street development. Or I'm taking this evidence to the FBI. Robert's response was cold, calculating. Samuel, you don't understand what you're dealing with. This isn't just about real estate. This is about power, about who gets to decide what happens in this city. And you're just an old man who doesn't know when to mind his own business. But don't worry. Your heart problems run in families, don't they? Stress can be a killer. 3 days later, her father was dead. Denise sat in that sterile bank vault and wept for the father she'd lost, for the communities that had been destroyed, and for the naive woman she'd been until yesterday. 20 years of marriage, 20 years of building a life with a monster who'd murdered her father and smiled at his funeral. She thought about Clara, asleep in their bed on the night her grandfather died, innocent and unaware that her father was a killer. How could she protect her daughter from this truth? How could she explain that their comfortable life, Clara's private school, their beautiful home, the family vacations, had been built on stolen land and broken lives? But as she dried her tears, Denise felt something new growing inside her. Not just grief and anger but determination. Her father had died trying to expose Robert's crimes. She wouldn't let that sacrifice be meaningless. The first call she made was to her mother. Grace Jefferson had never liked Robert, though she'd been too polite to say so directly. "Something about that man just doesn't sit right with me," she told Denise years ago. "He's too smooth, too charming. Makes me think he's hiding something." Now, sitting in her mother's modest living room in the same neighborhood where Robert had displaced so many families, Denise spread out the evidence like pieces of a puzzle that finally made sense. Grace listened in stunned silence as Denise explained everything: the broken pot, the hidden evidence, the recordings that proved Robert's guilt. When the audio of her late husband's final confrontation played, Grace closed her eyes and gripped her daughter's hands. "I knew something was wrong," she whispered. "Your daddy was worried about something those last few weeks. He kept saying he was close to something big, something that would help the whole community." And then she trailed off, unable to finish. "Mama, what do I do?" Denise asked, feeling like a child again. "I have proof that my husband killed Daddy, but I also have Clara to think about. If I go to the police, what happens to her? What happens to our family?" Grace was quiet for a long time, studying the photographs and documents spread across her coffee table. Finally, she looked up at her daughter with eyes that held both sadness and steel. "Baby, your daddy didn't raise you to hide from hard things. He raised you to stand up for what's right even when it costs you everything. These families that Robert destroyed, they had children too. They had dreams too. And they're still suffering while he gets richer." She picked up one of the photographs showing an elderly woman being evicted from a house her family had owned for 70 years. "This is Mrs. Ruby Jenkins. She used to babysit you when you were Clara's age. Robert forced her out of her home 3 years ago, and now she's living in a one-bedroom apartment across town, barely scraping by on Social Security." The weight of responsibility settled on Denise's shoulders like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just about her family anymore. It was about justice for everyone Robert had hurt, closure for families who'd never understood why their lives had been destroyed, and ensuring that no one else would suffer while Robert continued his crimes. That afternoon, while Clara was at school and Robert was at work, Denise made copies of everything and stored the originals in a new safety deposit box at a different bank. She researched investigative journalists, civil rights lawyers, and FBI agents who specialized in corruption cases. But she also started paying attention to things she'd ignored for 20 years. The way Robert controlled their finances, monitoring every penny she spent. The way he discouraged her from getting too close to neighbors or making friends outside his approved circle. The way he always seemed to know where she was and what she was doing. Had she been a prisoner in her own marriage without realizing it? That evening at dinner, Clara chattered about her day while Robert asked his usual questions about Denise's work, her plans, her activities. Questions that had seemed like caring concern for 2 decades now felt like surveillance. "You seem tired this morning," he said, cutting his steak with precise movements. "Everything okay?" "Just didn't sleep well," Denise replied, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "I kept thinking about that poor plant. I know how much it meant to you." Something flickered across Robert's face. Relief? Suspicion? Before he smiled. "Plants can be replaced, sweetheart. What matters is that nobody got hurt." But as Clara talked about her upcoming science project and Robert helped her plan her research, Denise realized that someone had gotten hurt. Many someones. And if she didn't act, many more would follow. After Clara went to bed, Denise excused herself to take a bath, but instead she called a number she'd found online. Angela Davis, an investigative journalist known for exposing corruption in city government. "Miss Davis? My name is Denise Thompson, and I have evidence of massive real estate fraud involving city officials. I think my husband killed my father to cover it up. Can you help me?" The words hung in the air like a bridge she couldn't uncross. Once she spoke them, there would be no going back to her old life, no pretending she didn't know the truth about the man she'd loved for 20 years. But as she heard Angela's sharp intake of breath and her immediate agreement to meet the next day, Denise felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Her father's fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Angela Davis was not what Denise had expected. The investigative journalist was younger than she'd imagined, with natural hair twisted into locks and eyes that seemed to see everything at once. They met at a small cafe in downtown Atlanta, far from Denise's neighborhood, at a corner table where they could speak privately. "Tell me everything," Angela said, pulling out a digital recorder after Denise had shared the basic outline of her discovery. "And I need to warn you, once we start down this path, there's no turning back. If your husband is as dangerous as you believe, exposing him will put you and your daughter at risk." Denise had spent the night thinking about exactly that risk. But she'd also thought about Mrs. Ruby Jenkins, about all the families whose lives had been destroyed, about her father's final words on that recording. Some things were worth the risk. Over the next 2 hours, she walked Angela through every piece of evidence, every recording, every document her father had hidden. Angela's expression grew more serious with each revelation, her questions more pointed and strategic. "This is bigger than just your husband," Angela said finally. "These recordings implicate city council members, planning commissioners, bank officials. We're talking about a systematic corruption scheme that's been operating for decades." "What does that mean for Clara?" Denise asked. "For my daughter's safety?" Angela's expression softened. "It means we have to be very careful about how we proceed. But it also means you have leverage. Men like your husband rely on everyone being too scared or too isolated to fight back. When their victims unite and work together, they become vulnerable." They agreed on a plan. Angela would begin investigating the paper trail, confirming details and reaching out to other victims. Meanwhile, Denise would continue her normal routine while carefully documenting any suspicious behavior from Robert. "Do not confront him," Angela warned. "Do not let him know you suspect anything. We need time to build an airtight case before he realizes what's happening." But acting normal proved harder than Denise had anticipated. That evening, when Robert came home with flowers, something he rarely did, she found herself analyzing his every gesture. "What's the occasion?" she asked, accepting the bouquet with what she hoped looked like genuine pleasure. "No occasion. Just thought my beautiful wife deserved something nice." He kissed her cheek and she had to fight not to recoil. "I was thinking we should plan a family vacation. Maybe to the Bahamas? Clara would love the beaches." The suggestion sent alarm bells through Denise's mind. Was he planning to take them out of the country? Was this part of some escape plan? "That sounds wonderful," she managed. "But isn't it expensive right now? With the new development project." Robert's eyes sharpened slightly. "Since when do you worry about our finances? I take care of the money, remember? You take care of our home and our daughter." There it was, the subtle reminder of the roles he'd assigned them, the boundaries he'd drawn around her life. For 20 years, she'd thought his handling of their finances was generous, protective. Now she understood it was control. Over the next few days, Denise began paying attention to things she'd never noticed before. The way Robert monitored her phone calls, always asking who she'd been talking to. The way he discouraged her from spending time with certain neighbors, always with reasonable-sounding explanations. The way he knew details about her day that she hadn't shared with him. Was he tracking her phone? Monitoring her email? The possibility made her feel violated in ways that went beyond his financial crimes. Meanwhile, Angela's investigation was uncovering a network of corruption that stretched far beyond what Denise's father had documented. Property tax assessors who deliberately undervalued homes in black neighborhoods, making them easier to acquire through forced sales. Bank officials who denied legitimate mortgages while approving predatory loans. City planners who rezoned residential areas for commercial development without proper notice to residents. "Your husband didn't create this system," Angela explained during their second meeting. "But he perfected it. He figured out how to use existing inequalities and corrupt practices to systematically target vulnerable communities." The most devastating discovery came when Angela showed Denise a map of Robert's developments over the past 15 years. Every single project had displaced a predominantly black neighborhood. Every single project had resulted in luxury housing or commercial development that the original residents could never afford. "He's been engaged in systematic ethnic cleansing," Angela said bluntly. "Using legal and financial tools instead of violence, but the result is the same: entire communities have been erased." That night, Denise looked at her husband across the dinner table and saw a stranger. Clara was showing them both her science project, a model of the solar system she'd worked on for weeks. Robert praised her efforts, helped her adjust the position of Mars, listened patiently to her explanation of planetary orbits. How could the same man who murdered her father be so gentle with their daughter? How could someone capable of destroying communities show such tenderness to his own child? "Daddy, why don't we know more of our neighbors?" Clara asked suddenly. "My friend Sarah knows everyone on her street, but we mostly just wave at people." Robert and Denise exchanged glances, but for very different reasons. "Well, sweetheart," Robert said carefully, "different neighborhoods have different cultures. We're friendly with people, but we also respect privacy. But wouldn't it be nice to know them better? Like Mrs. Jenkins seems really nice. She always waves at me when we drive by her apartment." Denise's heart clenched. Clara had noticed Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly woman Robert had displaced from her family home. "How do you know Mrs. Jenkins, baby?" Denise asked. "She was at the grocery store last week and she recognized me. She said she used to live in a big house near here but she had to move. She seemed really sad about it." Robert's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Clara, it's not polite to ask strangers personal questions about their living situations." "I didn't ask. She just told me. She said she missed her old house, especially her garden. She grew the most beautiful roses." That night, after Clara was asleep, Denise made a decision that would change everything. She drove to Mrs. Jenkins' apartment complex, a rundown building that was a stark contrast to the luxury condos that now occupied her former neighborhood. Ruby Jenkins answered her door with surprise and wariness. She was a small woman, probably in her 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes that held deep sadness. "Mrs. Jenkins? I'm Denise Thompson. My daughter Clara mentioned meeting you at the grocery store." Recognition dawned in the older woman's eyes, followed quickly by something else. Fear. "Child, you shouldn't be here," she said, glancing nervously down the hallway. "Your husband, he wouldn't like this." "Mrs. Jenkins, I need to talk to you about what happened to your house. About what my husband did to you and your family." For a moment, Ruby Jenkins stared at her in shock. Then, slowly, she opened her door wider. "Come in, child. I think it's time somebody heard the truth." What Denise learned that night broke her heart completely. Ruby Jenkins had lived in her family home for 47 years, had raised her children there, had cared for her elderly mother there until she passed. The house had been in her family since the 1940s, purchased by her father when he returned from World War II. Robert's company had started with seemingly reasonable offers to purchase the property. When she declined, the pressure began. City inspectors suddenly found violations that required expensive repairs. Her property taxes mysteriously increased. Her homeowner's insurance was inexplicably canceled. "Then the break-in started," Ruby said quietly. "Nothing taken, just disturbances. Things moved around. I'd come home and find doors open that I knew I'd locked. The police said there was nothing they could do without evidence." The final blow came when Ruby's grandson was arrested on drug charges that she swore were fabricated. The legal fees to defend him ate up her savings, and suddenly Robert's generous offer was her only option to avoid losing everything. "I knew it was wrong," Ruby said, tears flowing freely now. "I knew that man was behind everything that happened to us. But I was 72 years old, raising my grandson alone, and I didn't have anywhere else to turn." As Denise drove home that night, she understood that this wasn't just about seeking justice for her father's death. This was about seeking justice for Ruby Jenkins, for the dozens of other families Robert had destroyed, and for the community that had been systematically erased. But she also understood that she was dealing with someone far more dangerous than she'd initially realized. Robert hadn't just killed her father. He'd orchestrated a campaign of harassment and intimidation that had driven an entire community from their homes. And now she was living with him, sleeping beside him, raising a child with him. The next morning, as she watched Robert help Clara with her homework and kiss her goodbye before school, Denise realized that her greatest challenge wouldn't be building a legal case against him. It would be protecting Clara when Robert inevitably discovered what she was doing. Because men who destroyed communities and murdered fathers wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened their carefully constructed lives, even their own wives. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Denise was reviewing quarterly reports at her accounting firm. Angela's voice was tense, urgent. "We have a problem. I just got word that someone's been asking questions about our investigation. Someone with connections to City Hall." Denise's blood ran cold. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest your husband might know you're digging into his business. Can you talk? Are you somewhere safe?" Denise glanced around the open office space, her colleagues typing at their computers, completely unaware that her world was crumbling. I can talk but not for long. I think Robert might have people watching you. My source says someone matching your description was photographed meeting with me last week. They're trying to identify me through facial recognition software. The phone felt heavy in Denise's hand. She'd been so careful, so strategic, but somehow Robert was already 3 steps ahead. Of course he'd been planning and manipulating for decades. She was just an accountant who'd stumbled onto his secrets 5 days ago. What do I do? She whispered. We accelerate everything. I'm meeting with Detective Patricia Brown this afternoon. She's with the FBI Task Force on Municipal Corruption. But Denise, you need to be prepared. If Robert suspects something, he might try to relocate you and Clara. Men like him often take their families on sudden vacations, when they feel threatened. That afternoon, Denise left work early, claiming a family emergency that wasn't entirely a lie. She drove to Clara's school, her hands shaking as she signed her daughter out for a dental appointment. Mama, I don't have a dentist appointment, Clara said as they walked to the car. I know, baby. We need to talk about something important and I wanted us to have some privacy. They drove to Piedmont Park, where Clara had played as a toddler, where Denise and Robert had taken countless family photos, where everything had seemed perfect just a week ago. Now the familiar surroundings felt like a movie set, beautiful but fake, hiding dark secrets beneath the surface. Clara, I need to ask you something and I need you to tell me the truth, okay? Has Daddy ever talked to you about taking a trip? Maybe somewhere far away. Clara's 8-year-old face scrunched in concentration. He mentioned maybe going to see his cousin in California. But he said it was just an idea. Robert didn't have a cousin in California. Denise had met his entire small family over the years. This was exactly what Angela had warned her about. Robert was planning an exit strategy. Baby, has Daddy been asking you questions about what I do during the day? About who I talk to or where I go? Kind of. He asked if you seemed worried about anything or if you'd been acting different. I told him you seemed sad about breaking his plant. Clara's eyes widened with sudden concern. Mama, are you and Daddy having problems? Like Sarah's parents before they got divorced? Denise's heart broke. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that her father is a murderer without destroying her entire sense of security and safety? Clara, sometimes adults have to make very difficult decisions to keep the people they love safe. I might need to ask you to do some things that seem strange or scary, but I need you to trust me, okay? Clara nodded solemnly, though confusion clouded her young features. That evening, Robert came home with Chinese takeout, Clara's favorite, and news that made Denise's stomach drop. I've been thinking about that California trip I mentioned, he said casually while distributing chopsticks. Maybe we should go next week. I found a great resort near San Francisco, right on the beach. Next week? Denise tried to keep her voice light. That's pretty sudden. What about Clara's school? What about my work? Clara's ahead in all her classes. A week won't hurt. And you've been working so hard lately, you deserve a break. Besides, I think some family time would be good for all of us. The way he said family time sent chills down Denise's spine. Was this how he'd convinced other families to leave town before destroying their lives? With promises of vacations and fresh starts? Can we think about it? She asked. I'd need to arrange coverage at work and... Already done, Robert interrupted smoothly. I called your boss this afternoon and explained that you were dealing with a family emergency. He was very understanding about you needing extended time off. Denise stared at him in shock. You called my boss without asking me? I was trying to help, sweetheart. You've seemed so stressed lately, I thought surprising you with a vacation would be romantic. But his eyes held no warmth, only calculation. After Clara went to bed, Denise excused herself to shower but instead called Angela from the bathroom with the water running. He's trying to take us out of state, she whispered urgently. He booked a trip to California, already called my job. I think he knows. Okay, listen carefully, Angela said. We're moving forward tomorrow. Detective Brown has enough evidence to bring him in for questioning, but we need you to get Clara somewhere safe first. Can you take her to your mother's house? What if he tries to stop me? Then we call the police immediately. But Denise, once we start this process, there's no going back. Are you ready? Denise looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, the same mirror where she'd applied makeup for 20 years, the same face that had smiled at Robert through anniversaries and birthdays and family dinners, completely unaware that she was living with a killer. I'm ready. The next morning, Denise told Robert that she wanted to take Clara to visit her grandmother before their California trip. She's been asking to see Grandma Grace, and since we'll be gone for a while, I thought it would be nice. Robert's eyes narrowed slightly. Why don't we all go together? I haven't seen your mother in months. You know how Mama gets when too many people are in her small house at once? Denise said, forcing a laugh. Besides, you have that conference call with the San Francisco investors, right? It was a lie, but it gave Robert an excuse to let them go alone. As she packed an overnight bag for Clara, Denise included extra clothes, important documents, and Clara's favorite stuffed animal. If everything went according to plan, they wouldn't be coming back to this house for a long time. Grace Jefferson took one look at her daughter's face and understood immediately. It's time? She asked quietly while Clara played in the backyard. It's time, Denise confirmed. Mama, if something happens to me? Nothing's going to happen to you, Grace said firmly. Your daddy didn't raise a quitter and neither did I. We're going to see this through, and we're going to get justice for everyone that man has hurt. At 2 p.m., while Clara napped and Grace kept watch, Detective Patricia Brown and 2 FBI agents arrested Robert Thompson at his downtown office. The charges included racketeering, conspiracy, fraud, and murder in the first degree. Angela called with the news, her voice triumphant. It's over, Denise. He's in custody and his assets are frozen. The investigation is expanding to include all his co-conspirators. But as Denise hung up the phone, she realized this wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. The legal process would take months or years. The media attention would be intense. Clara would have to learn the truth about her father, and Denise would have to rebuild their lives from nothing. Most importantly, she would have to find a way to help the families Robert had destroyed while protecting the daughter she loved more than life itself. That evening, as she tucked Clara into bed at her mother's house, her daughter asked the question Denise had been dreading. Mama, why didn't Daddy come to say goodnight? Denise took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. Baby, sometimes people do things that hurt other people even when they seem nice and loving. Daddy has to answer some questions about choices he made that weren't right. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Is Daddy in trouble? Yes, sweetheart. He's in trouble. But you and I, we're going to be okay. We have Grandma Grace and we have each other and we're going to figure out how to move forward together. As Clara finally fell asleep, Denise sat by her bedside and made another promise, not just to her father's memory or to the families Robert had destroyed, but to her daughter. She would make sure Clara grew up knowing that actions have consequences, that standing up for what's right matters more than comfort or convenience, and that sometimes the people we love most are capable of unimaginable harm. But she would also make sure Clara knew she was loved, protected, and that her mother would move heaven and earth to give her a future built on truth rather than lies. The hardest part was still ahead, rebuilding their lives while seeking justice for everyone Robert had hurt. But for the first time in days, Denise felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. 6 months later, Denise stood before a packed courtroom as Robert's trial reached its climax. The man she'd loved for 20 years sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, his charm finally stripped away to reveal the calculating predator beneath. But Denise wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were focused on the gallery filled with faces she'd come to know well. Ruby Jenkins sat in the front row, her silver hair perfectly styled, her back straight with dignity. Behind her were the Washingtons, who'd lost their family business when Robert forced them from their building. The Martinez family, whose children had to change schools 3 times as Robert's developments pushed them further from the city center. Dozens of families whose lives had been shattered by one man's greed. They weren't just victims anymore, they were survivors, witnesses, warriors for justice. The transformation hadn't been easy. The first few weeks after Robert's arrest had been a whirlwind of media attention, legal proceedings, and emotional upheaval. Clara had struggled to understand why her father was suddenly gone, why reporters wanted to take their picture, why they were living with Grandma Grace instead of in their beautiful house. The house that, as it turned out, had been purchased with money stolen from the very communities Robert had destroyed. The defendant, Robert Thompson, orchestrated a criminal enterprise that lasted over 15 years, prosecutor Linda Foster told the jury in her closing argument. He didn't just steal money, he stole dreams, heritage, and hope from dozens of families. He destroyed communities that had existed for generations. And when Samuel Jefferson threatened to expose him, he committed murder to protect his secrets. Denise closed her eyes, hearing her father's voice again on those recordings that had become central evidence in the case. His courage, his determination to fight for what was right, had ultimately brought down the man who killed him. But the real victory hadn't happened in the courtroom. It had happened in the months leading up to the trial, as Denise worked with Angela and other activists to create something beautiful from the ashes of Robert's destruction. The Samuel Jefferson Community Justice Foundation had started as a simple idea. Use the money recovered from Robert's frozen assets to help displaced families rebuild their lives. But it had grown into something much more powerful. A movement that brought together affected families, community organizers, legal advocates, and young people determined to prevent future displacement. Clara had been instrumental in that growth, though she didn't fully understand it yet. Her 8-year-old perspective had helped Denise see things differently. "Mama, why don't we help Mrs. Jenkins get her house back?" Clara had asked one day while they were volunteering at a community center. "It's not that simple, baby. The house was sold to other people who didn't know it was stolen. But couldn't we help her get a new house? One that's just as nice?" That conversation had led to the Foundation's housing program, which had already helped 12 families secure new homes in their original neighborhoods. It had also sparked partnerships with local banks to provide legitimate, affordable mortgages to families who'd been exploited by predatory lenders. The education program had been Ruby Jenkins' idea. "These young people need to know their history," she told Denise during one of their planning meetings. "They need to understand how these systems work so they can protect themselves and their communities." Now high school students throughout Atlanta were learning about housing rights, financial literacy, and community organizing. Clara, despite being years younger than the program's target age, had become something of a mascot, her enthusiasm and questions helping older students think about complex issues in new ways. But perhaps the most meaningful change had been personal. Denise had discovered parts of herself that 20 years of marriage to Robert had suppressed. She was stronger than she'd known, more capable, more passionate about justice than she'd ever imagined. She'd also discovered that healing was possible, even after betrayal as deep as what Robert had inflicted on her and their daughter. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Patricia Coleman asked, bringing Denise's attention back to the courtroom. "We have, Your Honor." The jury foreman, a middle-aged black man who'd listened intently to every day of testimony, stood with the verdict paper in his hands. "On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration, not the raucous cheering of a sports event, but the profound satisfaction of justice finally served. Denise felt tears streaming down her face as she thought about her father, about all the nights she'd wondered if this day would ever come. On the charges of racketeering, conspiracy, and fraud, we find the defendant guilty on all counts. Robert showed no emotion as the guilty verdicts were read, but Denise could see his lawyers frantically taking notes, probably already planning appeals. The legal fight might continue for years, but the most important battle had been won. After the trial, the community celebration felt like a family reunion. Ruby Jenkins hugged Denise tightly, both women crying tears of relief and triumph. "Your daddy would be so proud," Ruby whispered. "He died fighting for all of us, and you made sure his death meant something." Clara, now 9 years old and more aware of her father's crimes, had struggled with conflicting emotions throughout the trial. She loved the father who'd read her bedtime stories and helped with her homework, but she also understood that he'd hurt many people, including her beloved grandfather she'd never had the chance to know. "Mama, do you think Daddy will ever say he's sorry?" Clara asked that evening as they walked through the neighborhood where Ruby Jenkins had once lived. Denise considered the question carefully. Robert had shown no remorse during the trial, had maintained his innocence despite overwhelming evidence. Some people, she'd learned, were incapable of acknowledging the harm they'd caused. "I don't know, baby. But what I do know is that we can't wait for other people to apologize before we start healing. We have to choose to move forward, to build something better, regardless of what he does." They stopped in front of the lot where Ruby's family home had once stood. A small garden had been planted there, maintained by neighborhood volunteers. A plaque read, "In memory of the families who called this place home. Their stories live on." "Tell me about Grandpa Samuel again," Clara said, settling onto a bench beside the memorial garden. Denise smiled, launching into familiar stories about her father's community work, his dedication to justice, his love for his family and neighbors. These stories had become precious gifts she could give her daughter, a connection to a grandfather Clara had never met, but whose legacy now shaped both their lives. As they talked, other families from the neighborhood stopped to chat. Children who'd been displaced years ago but had moved back thanks to the Foundation's programs. Elderly residents who'd managed to hold onto their homes during Robert's campaign of intimidation. Young activists who joined the movement after learning about the case. A community that had been scattered and broken was slowly healing, becoming stronger than it had been before. "Mrs. Denise," called a voice across the garden. A teenage girl named Shanice ran over, her face bright with excitement. "I got accepted to Spelman College. Full scholarship." Denise's heart swelled with pride. Shanice was one of the first students in the Foundation's education program, a brilliant young woman whose family had been displaced when she was 12. The scholarship was partly funded by money recovered from Robert's crimes, stolen wealth being transformed into opportunity for the next generation. "Your grandfather would have loved this," Ruby Jenkins said, appearing beside them with her characteristic quiet wisdom. "He always said the best revenge against people who try to destroy communities is to build them back stronger than they were before." As the sun set over the memorial garden, Denise reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The broken ficus pot that had revealed her husband's crimes. The devastating discovery that her father had been murdered. The months of investigation, legal proceedings, and emotional healing. But most importantly, the decision to transform pain into purpose, loss into legacy. The Samuel Jefferson Community Justice Foundation was now helping families in 3 states. Angela's investigative reporting had exposed similar corruption schemes in other cities. The legal precedents set by Robert's case were being used to prosecute other predatory developers and corrupt officials. Clara was thriving in her new school, surrounded by children whose families had been touched by the same struggles hers had faced. She was learning Spanish from the Martinez children, piano from Mrs. Jenkins, and leadership skills from the teenage activists who'd become her heroes. And Denise had found her calling, not just as an accountant managing budgets, but as an advocate fighting for justice, a community organizer bringing people together, a mother raising a daughter who understood that privilege came with responsibility. "Mama," Clara said as they prepared to leave the garden, "when I grow up, I want to be like you and Grandpa Samuel. I want to help people." Denise knelt down to look into her daughter's eyes that sparkled with intelligence, compassion, and determination. "Baby, you already are helping people. Just by caring, by asking questions, by believing that everyone deserves to live in safe, beautiful neighborhoods. That's how change starts, with people who refuse to accept that suffering is inevitable." As they walked home through streets that were slowly returning to life, new businesses opening, families moving back, children playing safely in renovated parks, Denise felt her father's presence. Not the grief and anger that had consumed her during the investigation, but the warm certainty that his sacrifice had meaning. Robert Thompson would spend the rest of his life in prison. The communities he'd destroyed were rebuilding. The families he'd scattered were reuniting. And a new generation of young people, led by brilliant spirits like Clara and Shanice, were learning that they had the power to create the world they wanted to live in. The broken ficus pot had revealed more than evidence of crimes. It had revealed strength Denise didn't know she possessed, connections she'd never imagined possible, and hope that could survive even the deepest betrayal. Samuel Jefferson's fight for justice had ended with his death, but his daughter's fight was just beginning. And she had an entire community standing with her, ready to ensure that no family would ever again face Robert Thompson's brand of destruction alone. As Clara skipped ahead, chattering about plans for the Foundation's next community garden, Denise smiled and whispered a promise to the evening sky. "We did it, Daddy. We got justice. And we're going to keep building the world you dreamed of, one family at a time." The broken pot had revealed buried secrets, but it had also planted seeds of hope that would bloom for generations to come.